Hello. Welcome to the Cold Fire Show, folks. How are you doing, Renee?
Good.
Good. So we got a lot to talk about, obviously, as we usually do.
Right.
So, but before we dig in, should we do drinks?
Let's do drinks.
What are you drinking?
I'm drinking a Smoking with Jesus, which I kind of made up a little bit because it was supposed to have tequila in it and be called Walking with Jesus. But I like mezcal better, and also Smoking with Jesus feels like a real, like, I'm the cool pastor. Like, you know who else liked things that grew out of the ground and were natural? And I feel like that's the energy of a lot of what we're going to talk about tonight. So
Yeah. So cool.
it's really good.
I'm a big fan. I'm a big fan of mezcal. So yeah.
I think if I did it again, I'd use about half the amount of simple syrup, though. I like the smoke to be really heavy.
Pronounced as the drink folks say. But yeah. All right, cool. I'm glad. And you said it's pretty good then, huh?
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to go wrong with mezcal and pineapple.
That's fair. All right. So mine, I'm going to bring on my nuclear drink. I went with a Believer, which will make sense as we get into which will make sense as we talk about this because Justin Bieber is involved. So this thing is a lot of blueberry vodka, blueberry curacao, lemon juice, tonic, handful of ice. Here it is. Look at that nuclear drink, baby.
I love, like, this show has given me a whole appreciation for curacao. Sorry.
The lemon juice in it actually kind of, I will tell you, when I smelled the blueberry vodka, I've never had blueberry vodka. It was like, that is the most potent artificial blueberry smell I've ever smelled in my life.
Oh, no.
And the lemon juice, but it still definitely tastes artificial blueberry. But and blue curacao actually doesn't really have a lot of blueberry flavor in it. It's just blue.
Yeah.
But not terrible. Definitely not the worst drink I've had in this show. I've had much worse ones in this show.
We've had a bunch of colored ones too. So
yeah, and the blue curacao keeps coming up a lot. And it is a cheap, shitty liqueur. And I was just like, okay, I guess I'm using it again. So
Daniel Fisher wants to know if it's orange flavored. No, I think you're thinking of oh no, I forgot what it's called. The thing that isn't Grand Marnier.
Oh, Cointreau?
Cointreau, yes.
Cointreau, whatever.
Whatever, yeah.
Yeah, they have a whole ad out now with Aubrey Plaza where she ridicules people for mispronouncing it, so that's fun. Which I saw several times in the Hulu docuseries, so I was like, okay.
A lot of people would enjoy being scolded by Aubrey Plaza. That's like
I think that's a kink, like an actual, like probably a legit kink for folks. Aubrey Plaza insulting me. Sign me up. So yeah. Anyway, so we do have some cult news, correct?
Yeah, this one's kind of...
Sorry.
Sorry, we've only been doing it for almost a year, and
yeah. Well, over a year.
Over a year.
Almost a year and a half.
I don't know my cues yet. It's okay. Yeah. So this is like, I don't know. This is actually almost a month old, over a month old, but we weren't here last month, so deal with it. Nancy Salzman's been released from the halfway house where she was serving time. She ended up serving less than 20 months of a 3.5-year sentence, which is still more time than Allison Mack served, even though Allison Mack literally physically raped people. So,
yeah, that's the whole money and fame help you in those respects. So.
That's very weird. Like, I know when we did NXIVM, you and I both talked about like having a lot of mixed feelings about her sentence, because she did a lot wrong.
Yes.
However, she didn't physically rape people like Allison Mack did. And they said they were going to take into consideration like the health of her parents. And then they were like, never mind. We're not really going to do that. So it was very interesting. And I think we'll get into a lot of discussion on this episode when we get into Hillsong about where the line between a victim and a perpetrator are in these cult scenarios. This one is a big old fat ugly mess of who's the victim, who's the perpetrator, in ways that I don't think we've even really encountered on this show, including with people like Nancy. So I thought it
Yeah.
was very fitting. And also, if you hadn't heard this news, if you're watching us, you know all about Nexium. So here's a little bit of news about her. I hope that she finds a job that doesn't involve neuro-linguistic programming or any charismatic men, and has a very happy life with her daughter, right? Is who we met on the documentary?
Yeah, and I'm not sure if her daughter got probation, as I recall. So
Yeah.
yeah, so hopefully so. Hopefully her and her daughter are not. I'm gonna say hopefully they're not too fucked up from that whole experience, because we've seen how that can fuck up people for life. So
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So you hope for the best, but again, I'm with you. I don't know how she got more time than someone who actually physically raped someone, but
Very
like
weird.
yeah. Well, we'll see a bit of this when we talk about our docuseries this time too, about how money and power actually help you in these situations. So,
We'll get all,
hooray!
yeah.
Oh, man. So, um, who were
We're
we were
gonna
talking about?
some of this because it's like there's a lot of stuff that needs to be like discussed, right? Like you can't make a
Yeah,
statement on one way or the other. So yeah, anyway. Tell us a little bit about Hillsong, Doug.
yeah. So Hillsong. What's interesting is I've been wanting to do Hillsong, but I was thinking of the old documentary, which is like
Right.
4 years old. This one is a newer one. This was back from, I believe, May of last year, so it's a year old.
Well, and
Um,
I think the first one wouldn't have had everything about the Houstons.
yes, which yeah, woo. Because that one actually focused a lot on Carl Lentz and did focus somewhat in Houston's on the origins of it. But
Yeah,
so
I think if you only knew the controversies around Carl Lentz and you didn't know what was going on at the same time and after, then you kind of are like, okay, like how many fucking megachurch pastors do this shit? I don't know why it's news other than that Justin Bieber goes to church there. Then in this documentary we find out. And I think I love that it was the reporters that were like, it's rather odd that they're punishing him. We need to look into this more.
yeah, yeah, and the punishment was rather severe,
Yes.
like complete ouster and all that stuff seemed rather severe for what. But like we're gonna get into it, but Carl Lentz was unfaithful to his wife twice that we know of. For unfortunately, I feel like there's more to the story than that. But like
I,
anyway.
I got theories too. We'll get there.
Yeah. So anyway, let's do a quick backdrop of Hillsong. Hillsong is a church that is headquartered out of Australia. It is a charismatic Pentecostal uh, evangelical church. So Pentecostal for
Ish, right? Like they kind of are, they kind of aren't.
yeah. Well, they try to do the mishmash of Pentecostal, which is kind of the speaking in tongues, that sort of stuff. Like when you see those weird videos where the pastor is doing the stuff where he pushes somebody in the head and they all collapse and like that's very, very, I'm going to say dramatic sort of style of preaching. But they combine it with the sort of new age, here's the hip pastor. We have all these instruments and music, which,
You're allowed to be sexy. You're just not allowed to have sex.
yes. Yeah. So Hillsong, just like I said, started in Australia. Um, what they dig into is how they start expanding. Like they kind of don't talk a lot about the origins until later, but New York City decides to plant a church. Hillsong decides to plant a church in New York City using Carl Lentz. Carl Lentz is a very attractive man who dresses very expensively, but like I say, he's a charismatic guy. Like
Yeah, he's
I don't
like
think we can deny that.
yeah, he's an incredible public speaker, and he just so happens to be married to the daughter of the founders of the church's very close friends, which I'm sure had nothing to do with anything. Um, yeah, he excelled at the Hillsong University that he went to.
Hillsong College, yes.
which some people claim didn't teach very much, but he said he learned a lot. That I think is worth mentioning.
Well, he learned a lot about how to minister in Hillsong. That's what he learned.
Right.
So, he didn't learn anything practical outside of how to expand the Church of Hillsong.
Right.
So, for him, that was a lot because that led him to rise in popularity in New York City. So the thing with Lentz is, like I said, he's a very charismatic, very handsome guy. And when you see these kind of sort of churches, you need a certain kind of person to lead it to make it grow. And the guy who eventually, which we'll talk about later, is Brian Houston, whose father founded the church, and he kind of accelerated it and realized Lentz was the guy to plant New York City because of how he looked, how he was a good public speaker, and how he could inspire people.
I think
So,
how pliable he was as well. But we'll get into that later. But the thing I think is interesting is you said that Brian Houston, or they don't say it Houston in Australia. It was like Houston or something.
Huston, like
Huston.
Huston.
There you
Yeah.
go.
That's the Australian. I wonder if they pronounce Huston, Texas. Like that's what
I don't know. Anyway, you say his father founded the church, but he would say that he founded his own church later, right? So, but we'll get there too, because there's this thing. Like, here's a great comment from Daniel again: smoke and voyeurs in lieu of mirrors. There's plenty of smoke and mirrors too. This church is super weird. Like, usually we get into what a cult believes. I don't think they know what they believe. They believe whatever is convenient in the moment to believe.
Whatever makes them money.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we'll get into that stuff. Oh man. And as usual, I take a gazillion notes and probably 90% of them are things we're not going to use.
I think, like, to give some structure, we might want to just like hit on like how fucking crazy it was in New York City, what the issues that the congregants had were, what happened with Carl and his wife, and then the background. Because otherwise, we'd be here all night and barely scratch the surface. This is like so crazy. It's so well, like I said, you don't know what they believe because they don't care.
As long as you keep throwing them money.
Yeah, and it's like you've got your obvious things, right? Where like apparently every Hillsong preacher in the US has to have a very specific leather jacket, or they share it like the traveling pants. I'm not sure, but there were a lot of that particular jacket on everybody in different cities around the US. Like, it's very they say that Brian Huston went and found someone who's going to help them like grow the church, but really he found like a branding person.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, because Carl Lentz was a proxy for him to grow it because he was an American too. Like
Right.
the thing is, even though Australians speak English, there's that sort of weird thing where he's still quote unquote a foreigner. So like there's an implicit bias there that people will be more likely to gravitate towards a charismatic guy who has an American accent as opposed to an Australian accent.
And what we find out too is that Brian Huston is not actually that charismatic.
No, he is not.
It's very actually really puzzling how he got to where he got. Whereas when you see, I mean, when I see Carl Lentz preach, I just get uncomfortable because I hate that whole like cool preaching thing. But like, you know that it does work, so it's like I get it. I don't like it, but I get it. With Brian Huston, it's like he's just yelling at you. Why? Okay.
Yeah, and that super gravelly voice of his, like it's just like not inspiring. Like I find it super. What's interesting is that like when you hear the recordings of his dad is like sort of like very not mild, but his voice is much more mild than Houston. Sounds very like Brian Huston sounds very gravelly compared to his father.
Like he shouted too much at the start of his preaching career, and now he's
Or like he smoked 6 packs of cigarettes a day for 20 years and like he's a super raspy thing.
I will
So
not fucking be surprised if that came out to be true because there's so much weird. Yes,
yeah,
for me, but not for thee.
yeah. All right, so let's roll into New York City because that's kind of where this stuff sort of takes off for the docuseries. Lentz goes into New York City. They basically like go into like sort of what is a nightclub at night
Yeah,
and do a church during the day or during Sunday. Like it was a little vague, like to me, but that's kind of the like, oh, well, we were cleaning up beer off the floor and like, like making it sound like they were by their bootstraps. And
well, and I think it's like in New York, they started in that massive venue, so I think it could have been a concert venue even.
I think maybe you're right. Maybe it was a concert venue, but it
'Cause
was like,
in the Australian version, they expanded into larger spaces, but in this one, they just started there and started filling it up somehow.
yeah, yeah. So they started small because they were new. And I think it was something they said something like they by within the first year they had like 7,000 congregants in a year, which is like crazy growth for a church. Just a
Yeah.
new church coming in, and I think we can attribute that part to Carl Lentz because of his ability to speak in a manner that draws people in, and he looks a certain way.
And I think they didn't really touch on this very much. They talk about how, Brian Huston and certainly Carl Lentz, like, enjoyed getting to schmooze with celebrities, but they didn't really talk about why that was important. And the reason it was important is because people would go to this church because from the outside, it looks cool and fun and progressive. And there's a
Mhm.
band and, it's fun and it's a cool place to be. So as soon as you have a line out the door, then, there's going to be a line out the door every Sunday. So I think that's also part of it is like we were hearing about Hillsong through Justin Bieber. And I think that's where, forgot his name, Chris Pratt goes as well. He goes the LA one, right?
Yeah.
So like we're hearing about it through these different things. And it's like, oh, well, they're like, this cool hip church that cool hip people go to. And then you started to hear the rumblings that like maybe they're homophobic, but I don't know because they haven't said so. And like then it started to get a little bit weird. But I think the celebrity relationships were also a huge part of the growth. And I think Carl Lentz being that certain type of guy was able to nurture those and make it seem cool, right? Like at one point they said he was the chaplain for the Knicks.
Yes. I have a lot of issues with the I have a lot of issues with religion in general, but that's me. But the idea of having like, hey, listen, it, a lot of sports franchises are, I say strangely, but maybe not, have a lot of religious overtones in it. Like a lot of pastors and chaplains for and make it clear, it's Christian pastors. It's not a variety of pastors for everybody of different faith. If you are Muslim, you are expected to kind of worship on your own.
Well,
But
and ostensibly, when you take a role as a chaplain, you are just everybody's spiritual advisor.
which is
And it
not
doesn't ever
that's
really work that way because even, if you're Catholic, if you're Baptist, if you're evangelical, if you're Mormon, if you actually like go to a progressive church, they do exist. Like
yeah,
that's could be as different as being Muslim and Catholic.
yeah. Well, also what another part of this whole experience of New York City like starting is it wasn't just Carl Lentz, it was one of Brian Huston's kids. It was
Oh,
Joel.
yeah, I forgot about
Joel was apparently an extraordinarily gifted musician. So that's where the music element comes in. And music is huge in the Hillsong story and how they build.
yeah, the music got to the US before the church got to the US, which I guess I forgot when I was saying like they had other ways that they had grown.
I forgot too.
Yeah. I mean, because like there's like a whole bunch of talk about the music in this documentary, and some of it's really bad, but it's also just like not even close to the most interesting thing that's happening. They're like taking over Christian music, which should be interesting because Christian music is taking over like terrestrial radio now, and we should all be terrified. But that's maybe
Yes.
an episode of this podcast live stream. Sorry.
Joel is apparently like a super talented and like really recognized Christian songwriter and musician, to the point that Hillsong actually wins a Grammy through one of his songs, which is bonkers. That's bonkers. A freaking Grammy. Like what? I don't know. What what I find interesting about that and is the idea that like Christian music tends to mimic pop music, but too late.
Yes.
Like they'll do, oh, well, that's cool. That's a trend. Yeah, that was a trend 6 months to a year ago, and you're just hopping on the train now. It's a bit too late. But yeah, apparently he was super good. So
There was a lot of Christian ska coming out of
Christian ska.
Yeah. Oh, it was huge. So like the OC Supertones, for like our 3 people who like ska music, the OC Supertones were huge during like the ska moment in the 90s, and they started out as a Christian band. Like Christian ska got big first, and then radio ska happened, not the other way around. In this one specific weird little moment.
Oh, so they're like the exception that proves the rule. Then they were
Yeah,
they got it before that actually went pop.
well, there was a lot of Christian, like I think Five Iron Frenzy was also a Christian ska band first. Like there's a lot, if you were into ska, of names you would recognize, and you'd be like, they were what? They did who?
Yeah. Well, shout out to my friend Joel Grotzik, who is actually the guy who did the website for Five Iron Frenzy before he left
Oh,
religion. So yeah, yeah. Thanks, Daniel, for that. All right. Yeah. So you're talking about Justin Bieber and his part, like he went into Hillsong, and they made a big deal about how he was sort of troubled at the time. Okay. So I'm going to tell you something my wife said that I was like, ooh, I didn't consider that, but she made a point was that, hold on, I have a note of it. And I was just like, she made the connection that the allegations against Diddy and how Bieber was sort of passed around, that's just recently come, that maybe coincided with him having his troubles at that time, which led him to go to Hillsong and be baptized at Hillsong. And baptized, which I found really interesting, was baptized in an NBA player's tub because he was 7 feet tall.
yeah. So yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, that part was weird, but I guess you don't think about like if you're as tall as an NBA player and you make NBA money, then you want a bathtub you can fit in. And then people who don't have that for themselves might come and ask to borrow your giant bathtub.
Yeah, I am 6 foot tall, and the tub I have to sit in is like made for somebody who's 5'1".
I'm 5'2", and I have only lived in one house my entire life that had a bathtub that was like
Comfortable.
luxurious. Yeah.
Yeah, because like when I like, not to get too far into the weeds, but sometimes because I'm old, my back hurts, and I will go take an Epsom salt bath to soak my back, and I either have to lay with my knees scrunched up, or I have to sit up with my legs straight out. Like I don't have a way to actually just enjoy the Epsom salt bath.
Back with your arms and legs up like a dead bug.
I could do that. I could do that, I suppose.
Or make friends with an NBA player.
Yeah. Yeah. Unfortunately, I don't have that. That would be cool, but I do not have that. So, one thing I want to talk about too is like when Hillsong starts growing in New York City, they start doing how many services per day?
Well, so this was something I found really interesting. So they said 7, but it didn't happen like a normal church, even a mega church will be like, all right, our services are at 10 a.m. They're like, oh, we have so many people coming. We're going to introduce a second service, and that'll be at noon. Mm-hmm. Whereas at Hillsong, it was like, well, there's people waiting outside. We're just going to do another service. And they would continue doing that, which, Carl Lentz does point to like that kind of tempo being part of what fucked him up and led him to be like destructive, which I can buy. Like, he said he called Brian Huston and said, I'm doing 7 services every Sunday. I can't keep up. Like, we need to like slow the growth down. And Huston's response was like, when I was your age, I did 10.
Yeah, when I was your age, I walked up to school in the snow, both ways.
Yeah. It's like, did you do, first of all, did you? And second of all, like, were they to this many people? They definitely weren't this energetic because we've seen the 2 different men preach. I mean, and then here's the other thing. So they get to 150,000 people coming. They get to like 7.
across 30 sites worldwide. Let's make that very clear.
Yeah, sorry. But like his group is still thousands upon thousands of people. They're filling this like stadium size place multiple times on Sunday. It sounds like they're doing some kind of services midweek. I didn't really get that. Um, and like, I'm not a big fan of church, as anybody who watches this knows, but I know what church is supposed to be. And you're supposed to be able to, after church, like pop by the pastor's office and be like, hey, I'm kind of struggling with some stuff. Can we talk?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the thing with mega churches. That's impossible.
Like, I've been to mega churches that are in the thousand, in the hundreds, like 1,500 people maybe, and like they have like a little pastoral care team. But it seems like Hillsong has like one guy who preaches every sermon, and then they have like their wife, because it's
Smoking hot wife. That's the term that we hear from the pastors all the time. Smoking hot wife. My wife makes fun of that all the time.
smoking hot wife.
I know, gross, right?
When Carl said that they had 2 children, 2 products of passion, I threw up in my mouth. Like, do not fucking speak to me that way. Anyway.
Also, they had 3 kids, so only 2 of them were products of passion.
I think that is it. I hope that was an old clip. Now I can't. Like, I'm like on the continuity. I was like, did she have long hair when he said that? Anyway, their wife, and then they have like the music team, and that's it. Everything else is volunteer, so they're not providing pastoral care. They're cleaning up beer before church service. So it's like, where exactly is the church part of this church?
Yeah, and the volunteer things is I remember seeing it in the previous doc, and it was something that again, my wife who grew up in evangelical churches heard this all the time from the volunteers. A derivative of, can you believe we get to do this?
Yeah.
Like, it was a way to make it seem like, oh, well, we are just doing God's work.
We're so privileged.
And we're so privileged. We get to do this for free and dedicate, a close to full-time job just to do something for free for God.
Well, when
And
we hear from some of the people that were heavily involved at the New York site, like they were the people who did get to talk to Carl Lentz, right? They said that they had people who they did not have the time to work because their volunteer schedule was so bad. And when they would ask for help to eat, they were told that it was illegal for a church to give money to people, which is like, no, it
no,
is
that's
not
kind of
at all. What are you talking about? Who, like, the audacity to tell a lie like that blows my mind.
like a church in its capacity is to help people. That's the baseline of what a church is, regardless of faith, is to help people. And the idea of being like, well, we can't help you because that would be illegal. That is a bunch of shit.
Yeah, when I think it was like the way it was phrased is like, yeah, the way you phrased it, that probably is illegal. It was, we can't give lump sums of money to people, which no, you can't. You can give stipends to your volunteers. You can actually, you know what? You can't give stipends to volunteers. This is like a thing I know because I did work with nonprofit. But but you can have a food pantry, you can have gas cards, you can
Mhm.
have rent assistance programs, you have all kinds of things that make sure that the people who are working for your church more than full time can eat and pay their rent in New York City of all fucking places.
Yeah. Yeah, like Mama Jones, who I can't remember her first name, but she
Um,
was
right here, Mary.
Mary Jones, who is known in the church as Mama Jones, was like made a very big deal about it. Like, you're in New York City, one of the most expensive places to eat, and you're not letting these people work and you're not helping them. Like, just I, like I, it's to that point too, is like, how many times have you seen churches band together to raise money for someone who has cancer or who had a house fire, or like they'll go and they'll raise money and they'll give money to those folks.
It's never the ones with this much money because they have, God, I don't even know where it ended up, but we had like when New York City's congregation was picking up, they were making hundreds of millions of dollars per year. So who knows where they ended up. But and then you have like, the thing that's going on with the SEC investigation into Ensign Peak, which is an investment firm owned by the Mormon Church. And that's like what they call, bishop roulette, whether or not they're actually going to help you if you're starving. It's never like, it's always the church where people are like barely have two pennies to rub together, that if your house burns down, they will help you. And the ones that have hundreds of millions of dollars, it turns out their focus is on making them money. That's how they got hundreds of millions of dollars.
Yeah, and it is. You're exactly right.
Not opening the church during hurricanes and shit. Like it's.
Thanks, Joel Osteen, you piece of shit. But I will say that I have a friend who is a pastor in the South, in a rural, but he goes into the city to preach. And what they do is they open up a food pantry. You are not required to sit through a sermon. They are there to literally feed people. And if you decide to stay around and listen, awesome. But that to me, like, listen, I'm not religious, but to me, if you're going to be religious, that's what you should be doing. You should be trying to help the people, even if they're not in your congregation. Like, to me, like, if that's what you're going to do, as
You're
you're
going
going
to
to,
tax exempt.
yeah, man,
You pay taxes, do whatever the fuck you want, right? Like, I don't care. But if you're not going to pay taxes, then maybe you should operate like every other entity that is allowed to get away with not paying taxes. Just a thought. I will say this. I want to make sure that we don't forget to say this because it's so exciting to me. But the result of all of Hillsong's fucking crazy is not only is the Australian government looking into whether or not they should be allowed to be tax exempt, the Australian government is now looking into like
all churches
change the rules because this is fucked up and there's too many tax exempt churches doing crazy stuff. And just like maybe call or write your representative if you think that's a cool idea.
I think that's a great idea. Like, especially mega churches, those people should be taxed out the wazoo. Like, you have extravagant expenses.
Yeah, what I'm going to say, like, I've been a member of a very non-mainstream church, and they were in a battle with the IRS for over a decade over their property rights because of taxation. And so it is not evenly applied, right? It's not just as easy as saying you're a church. You have to maybe be a very specific kind of church, and guess which kind.
Yeah. All right. So we're still in the first episode. We're actually keeping somewhat on track. But one thing I think we would be remiss if we did not talk about the idea of how Carl Lentz kind of stood in the face of every other Hillsong, or at least in most evangelical communities, say that Black Lives Matter when that was happening. Like, he actually went out of his way to say that.
I gotta say, I think he was being genuine with that.
Mm-hmm.
But I thought he was so fucking slimy about how he responded to the race issues after the fact.
Very much so, because he had a meeting with the BIPOC folks in his congregation. They're like, "You're not hearing us."
I think so. So Mama Jones said like it seemed like he really wanted to do something about it, but I don't know if he really didn't care or he just didn't have time. And that's when she's talking about that he was the chaplain for the Knicks, and he was on the road with the Knicks, and he was doing all these services every Sunday and blah, blah, blah. And so I do think that there's a very real possibility he legitimately did not have time to deal with anything. But that's not what he says when he's coming back to defend himself, because that's all he does, by the way. There's no apology in
Yeah.
his pieces
There's some small apologies for certain things. Let's
to his wife.
yes, he very much apologetic to her.
But when they talked to him about the race issues in the church and him not doing enough, he was like, well, like I tried, and then people were like, but that's not my culture, or that person doesn't represent me, and I couldn't make everybody happy. So I just had to do what I thought was right. And it's like, well, no, that's not how it actually works. If he had said, I was overworked, I was overstressed, I was trying to help with this, group of congregants that came to me with this issue, but like I was doing a million services every Sunday and traveling with the Knicks and I was burnt out, I would have maybe believed him, because those are facts. But like, oh, nothing I did was ever good enough. It's like, okay, cry me a fucking river, rich white guy who seems to still be living just fine.
Yeah, driving like a really fancy Dodge Charger.
I mean, I did put together finally that they are living with his in-laws, which has to fucking suck for him. But
Yeah, imagine doing that.
anyway, don't if you're going to cheat on your wife and have to move in with your in-laws, don't do it in the most high profile way where everyone knows exactly what you did and who you did it with.
Yeah. You're right, Daniel. There was private jets involved. So yeah, there's that. This was great. I don't know if you've ever seen the John Oliver thing where he did with Rachel Dratch, where they made their own religion for people to donate to.
Oh yeah.
That was super genius. But John Oliver is very smart about that kind of stuff. So
Right,
yeah,
and he has a team.
yeah,
It's a little bit harder, and I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm sure that the like people who know how to do it can do it, but like I legitimately, um, yeah, lives that donate matter to them is absolutely true. Going back, actually, you know what? Let's go back to that, because the other thing that happened is you had the guy Josh, who was gay, and he was so pleased that he could come to church with his boyfriend, and they could hold hands and sit in the front row together, and then he'd get up because he was part of the music team, and he felt so welcome and had no idea that they were anti-gay. And then he tells Carl, I'm going to go on Survivor and I want to tell them that I am gay and I go to church here. And Carl says, yeah, do that. And then Brian Huston is the one that says basically that this guy doesn't exist, which is like so fucked up, right? Not to say I wasn't aware that there was a gay choir director, but that person doesn't exist. Really fucked up. But he makes it clear that they are anti-gay, and that's where I was saying earlier. It's like, do they even know what they believe? I think that Carl probably really believed that he was doing the right. Yeah, that's going to bring us so much publicity. It's going to be
yeah.
great.
And we say all are welcome. So yeah.
And Brian Huston was like, "Oh, you got the wrong message. We don't like gay people."
But to be fair, Carl did go on The View or something like that, where he basically said that marriage was between a man and a woman.
But that was after.
Yes.
That's where I think, and I mean, like, this guy had no backbone. Like, let me say, when I say I think he thought that he was preaching at a welcoming church, I'm not excusing him, because when he found out that he wasn't, he just started riding the party line, right?
Yep. Yeah, it was cold.
Which is like why later when he's like, well, you can't always be the guy who's pushing back. Eventually you got to move on to a different game. And I think that's where I was headed. And it's like, brother, not even for half a second do I believe that you're on your way out when you got busted.
Yeah.
Never. You never gonna convince me of that.
Yeah.
You got busted. That's why.
He proclaims he was thinking about it, but didn't. Which brings us to the ouster of Carl Lentz. So, like I said, we're almost to the end of episode 1 here. But this is where we get into his infidelity. The first one is running Kareem. She says that she had an affair with him. Lentz told her to never Google him.
This is it, Doug. I love the idiocy behind this plan, okay? I'm going to lie to you about who I am, what I do, and whether or not I'm married, but I'm going to give you my name and then be like, don't Google it though. Like, honey, what were you thinking? Like,
Yeah.
we're always going to end up with this woman on daytime talk shows. Like, it was always going to happen because when this is what I believe happened on her side, right? She's like, I don't know, like he's probably full of shit, but he's cute, right? And then like feelings get involved, and she's like, oh, like I still think he's full of shit, and the things he's saying sound
Mhm.
pretty full of shit. Then she finds out who he is, and she's like, oh, okay, well now I'm
You
fucking
are full of shit.
yeah, now I'm pissed, and I'm gonna make sure that everybody knows you're full of shit. Which I'm like,
Yep. Yep. As the boomers say, "You go, girl." So yeah.
go girl, good for her.
Yeah. Um, yeah.
So then he tells us it comes to him before it goes public. So he has a chance to tell his wife, which I think is nice. It's so much better that she didn't have to learn about it on the news.
Yep.
I have a lot of empathy for his wife. But then he doesn't
She's
tell
a
every
she's a true believer. Like Laura, his wife, I think, is a true believer in God. Now, later on, not so much in the church, but yeah. Go
funny
ahead.
thing that happens after people have a lot of therapy, right? Just saying.
Yep.
So he doesn't tell her everything, which I feel like is pretty fucking typical, right? Like you want to kind of be like, maybe if I only admit what I have to, like we'll get through it and nobody ever has to know that I was also fucking the nanny.
Yeah.
But
Well,
this
to be
is
fair, the nanny stuff comes out later. So yeah.
what comes out when they get on the Zoom call with Brian Huston to say, this is going to come out. This is what happened. I've told my wife. And then Brian Huston asks, what about Leona? And this is why I want to talk about it. He already fucking knew.
Hmm.
Because if you're coming to me, Doug, and you're like in private, obviously not on Cult Bar, you're like, look, I got to tell you something that's really fucked up, but I've been cheating on Jill with this woman who's completely outside of my social circle, outside of my job, outside of everything that touches anything that you know about me. My first question is not going to be, what about a woman that you do know that is connected to all these things?
Yeah, that's true.
They're so separate. Brian Huston says, well, what about Leona? And then that's when Laura Lentz falls apart because of course she knew that something shady was going on and could never get like solid confirmation. This woman who was living in her house,
She's
her
a
husband
nanny.
fucking her. And this is where it starts to get super fucking convoluted, right? Because Leona was married to a different Hillsong pastor who ran the Boston church.
Mhm.
And instead of being his women's minister person, like the wives are supposed to, she's nannying for Carl and Laura while they have another person who came from Hillsong College nannying for them. And she is spending like Christmas at their house. She doesn't leave to go home to her husband and her kids. She just stays there. And not in terms of like unfair working conditions for the nanny, in terms of like, Laura, please go home. No, thanks, I'm good. I have a nanny. And I'm like, I don't understand this like nannies all the way down structure that's going on. But when it comes out that they're having an affair, you're like, well, that's why she never wanted to leave.
Yeah.
But then it comes out that she says most of the touching was unwanted. And then you get in this really fucked up place of like, everybody in the situation has a reason to lie, except for Laura, I feel like. And as we get into the next episode, we see like, it's so convoluted. I believe with all my heart that Leona was a victim because he was her boss and he had such high standing in the church, way bigger than her husband. It was 100% inappropriate. And in my opinion, when the power balance is that big, you can't say that anything was truly 100% consensual because it just doesn't work that way.
Right.
But then the church kind of goes on this like smear campaign against Carl, and she and her husband get to stay in their cushy situation, and Carl and Laura don't. And it's just
Yeah, they
Everybody's
dismissed.
a victim. Like Carl is definitely a victim of Hillsong, but he's more of a perpetrator than anybody else in the story so far.
Yeah. And and Hillsong at this point dismisses them and calls it a moral failure. Like they didn't like that's a really ambiguous term to
Well, I
me.
feel like my opinion is if a church is working the way that they tell us they're supposed to work, which is never how they work, but that's besides the point. Your pastor, your star of the game pastor comes to you with his wife and they're like, look, we are in big trouble. I fucked up. This is what's going on. Absolutely, that guy doesn't get to preach anymore. He doesn't have a job anymore because he fucked up.
Hmm.
But like, I don't have to work somewhere to be welcome in the community formed around it. So why did he and his wife just get booted? And his wife is like Hillsong royalty. They just got
Hmm.
booted and left to deal with it on their own. And when his wife contacted the Hustons and said, "Listen, my kid tried to kill herself over the stress of everything that's going on," and the counselor said, or the therapist said, she cannot handle anymore. The other kids are at their breaking point as well. Please, please do not go public with the details. I know you have to make a statement, but please keep the details to a
Keep it
minimum.
as vague as you can. Yeah.
They didn't just put the details out, but they released audio where Brian Huston was making assumptions and like taking guesses at what he thinks is going on and making Carl out to be like the worst person to ever walk the face of the planet, which is ironic what we learn about Brian Huston later. But I mean, it was so fucking awful and so targeted that it makes me feel uncomfortable trusting people who got to stay in when they're saying bad things about Carl and Laura in relation to the situation. But at the same time, if you're slimy enough to fuck your nanny right under your wife's nose, you're probably slimy enough to grope her without her consent. So now we're back to like, well, I don't trust this motherfucker still, even with all of his supposed therapy. And it's
Mhm.
very like, it was the most uncomfortable part of the thing for me was when they released Leona's statement and you're like, that could definitely be true. It could definitely also be part of what they're doing to Carl and Laura to discredit them. It could be both. And maybe it is
Yeah.
both.
Yeah. I mean, we're getting into some tricky territory on this part because along this time in the docuseries, Carl was talking about how, um, and again, to your point where he just kind of doesn't accept part, he will say, well, I made mistakes, but Hillsong made mistakes too. So yeah, but so you're owning it kind of, but not fully owning it, and you totally should. So there is that bit. But what I sorry, I'm just trying to find a way to say this because it's tricky.
It is so
Car-
tricky.
Carl talks about how as a kid he was sexually abused. And my policy is believe accusers until you have reason not to.
Right.
And so I'm not going to doubt him on that. If you're saying that happened to you and you
I think
know,
I think he fits the profile of somebody that's dealing with unresolved trauma and like pouring
sure.
himself into Hillsong in the first place. He talks about having some kind of substance use issue that like he was abusing Adderall. Well, they didn't say Adderall; they said ADHD medication, but I think it was Adderall. That's my guess. He's abusing prescription medication, and he is like acting out with multiple partners. He was talking about like compulsive porn use, I think, at some point, and it does seem like when you look at somebody who has unresolved trauma, that's how they behave. It doesn't mean they're not responsible for their behavior. And I got this like weird, icky feeling that he was one of those people who was like, I'm going to figure out why I did it. And when he figured out why, he stopped working on himself. I could be wrong and I hope I am, but it was very much like, oh, I'm responsible for what I did, but not the things that happened to me. It's like, okay, but you, at no point did he say there was no excuse for me to do the things that I did. I understand now how I got there, but I did them and I could have quit if it was too much work. I could have come to my wife for comfort instead of other women. I could have, whatever, a million things he could have done. He never says that. He's just like, I'm sorry for doing it. And it's because I was overworked and it's because that I had unresolved trauma. And it's like, well, those are reasons. They're not excuses. They're not like a note that you get to take to the principal and get out of trouble.
Right. Yeah, it's like we said, like I said, it's just kind of tough to hear someone say they've been sexually abused and then not be empathetic to what happened, but at the same time, just because you experience it doesn't mean you get to harm others as a result.
Right.
That, hurt people is a phrase. And yeah, he did. He definitely skipped some of the steps. And he talked about being in recovery he went to a very specific recovery thing for like
Yeah.
pastoral burnout, depression, and anxiety. And I was like, that's very specific, but it makes sense. Like I
I'm glad
imagine
it
that.
exists because a lot of these guys are taken advantage of in ways that make me very uncomfortable. And
Yeah.
very few of them have the proper training of a counselor or therapist and normal people that deal with these issues. But it does sound like he needed to go to like a rehab
Yeah.
where at the end, where it's not just like, I understand now why I abused substances and treated people like shit, but also like, I understand how to avoid doing it in the future and that I am ultimately responsible for those things. Like, anyway, I just say this because I have a lot of empathy. It doesn't come across. I have a lot of empathy for Carl Lentz. Watching it, especially knowing that like he was railroaded for a very specific reason that didn't have anything to do with him, knowing that he and his family were left to just fucking twist in the wind.
Mm-hmm.
All of it. I have a ton of empathy. And he does seem like somebody who, on some level, is real about wanting to be a better person than he was. But I also don't trust him and think he's a little slimy.
Yeah, that's fair. That's a good assessment because that's kind of where I am. Like I want to believe him, but at the same time, I'm a little distrustful of him because of.
I just listened to this podcast called I think it's called Do You Know Micah? And it was about a romance scammer, but he wasn't getting money off these women. He was just being really narcissistic and shitty. But anyway, he agrees to be interviewed on the podcast. And he's very sorry and he hopes these women are all okay and he's doing better and he's not on dating apps anymore and he cries. And she tells him, I really want to believe you and you're doing a really good job, but like every woman that you did this to told me that this is how you were going to act because this is how you act when you get caught and then you go do it again. And then sure enough, when she investigated further, like he is on dating apps, like whatever, right? It's still happening. And so I went into watching Carl Lentz say how sorry he was having just listened to that podcast. Like he sure is saying all the right things, but that doesn't mean that he means them.
Yeah. Yeah. The thing is how do you know that? Like at the end when he's talking about like I have my circle and it's 5 people. Where's his parents?
Well, and here's the other thing. This is another reason he needs to go to a real rehab program because they'll tell you that that's not how you do it, bro. Like you can't especially you can't do all of that to your wife and kids and then make your wife and kids your only emotional support, you fucking idiot.
Yeah.
But also it's like, where's your recovery community that's going to help you stay on track when you feel like abusing Adderall again or you feel like you want to go do something destructive and they can be there and be like, you know what, bro, like it isn't drugs but it's really destructive, are you sure you want to do that? Like where are those people?
Yeah, I mean, there's a point where he talks about how his wife has all these books around, like talk about how to recover from a cheater and like all these different things. He's like, can we get rid of it? She's like, no. And good on her.
I think that she is really real, telling the truth completely when she says that if he stops working on himself, she'll leave. That when she says she's grown a lot, she doesn't need him anymore, all of this, I believe her 100%.
Yep, me too.
I hope that she is betting on the right horse. I hope that he continues to become a better person, like for the world, because the world needs better people. But like, she is like, nobody deserves to have that kind of personal drama rocket through their entire, like everyone they know and the world. And then also all the people you know are just like, oh, we don't know you anymore.
Yeah. Hmm. Yeah, because I mean, when you leave a religion or you leave a church, there's a real separation. It's basically because a lot of those folks in the church will not associate with you anymore.
And in this case, it was also her parents.
Yeah.
Her parents and the Hustons were best friends. And her parents obviously think, I mean, I shouldn't say obvious because sadly it isn't obvious in situations like this, but her parents took her side, took her and her kids and wayward husband in because they don't need money anymore, right? But like, you know that they didn't get to keep their close circle of friends either.
Yeah. Also, can we talk about the idea that he said he wanted to fall off the radar and he went to fucking Florida? Like Florida, really? That's as far removed from everything. But no, it is not. It's fucking Florida. Like,
I think I think it's stupid, but I kind of buy that he thought that. Like, I think he probably had a real New York City attitude about Florida.
that's fair.
And I think
I think there's two New York City. There's two New York City attitudes towards Florida, and Daniel, you can comment on that. My idea would be like it's either that's where all the old people from New York retire,
right.
or fuck that place. It's like it's
Yeah.
like two modes of action.
But that's what I think. I mean, I think he saw it as like, well, nobody from New York likes Florida, right? Like, right, Zach? That's because he was walking with Jesus instead of smoking with Jesus. Come on. No.
Yeah. I
But
think
it is like,
Zach missed your cocktail though. So
I do think there's an element of like the bubble that people are in. So like, well, I can't go to anywhere where there's a Hillsong. And that's probably as far as he got.
maybe that's a
He was
good
like, he's not a
idea.
very smart guy. And I don't mean to be mean, but that's not a quality that comes across when he's speaking and talking about like his life and his education.
Fair. So before we start delving into the Hustons or the Houstons, which we need to go into because we're focusing on Carl Lentz because he was the main focus of episode 2. So there is a part where we need to talk because in the Houston Huston concept, they were really super worried about Carl because of how charismatic he was, that he would start his own church and take people away from Hillsong. So Brian Houston like just disparaged the shit out of Carl the entire time. So yeah.
But I also think so. There's that, and I think there's also he really wanted to look like the kind of guy who would never.
Yeah.
And I think like that is because as Carl Lentz is having his downfall, Australia is finally, we need to look into this shit that Brian Huston's father did.
Yeah.
And real quick, because I forgot, there's a couple things in my notes we didn't go over when we were talking about the start of the New York church. And some of this involves the Hustons. So because they were big money, and looked like you have a lot of money, right? So they did have like big neon crosses, like the 90s goth clubs, which love the aesthetic, hate the reason behind it. 20 different business entities under Hillsong total, not just in New York. But then like when they were talking about all these issues with the unpaid work and the musicians not getting paid everything, one of these guys says, we spent too much time wondering if we could do it instead of should we do it or something. Like he quoted Jurassic fucking Park.
Yeah.
Did you catch that? In my notes it just says don't quote Jurassic Park to me. Don't quote the sacred texts. Like, yeah, anyway. But I wanted to get, because there's this thing of like all this money and flash. None of the people involved got to have any of it. We talk about how big the music was. They didn't get any money.
Yeah, the musicians got no money, even though Hillsong made millions and millions of dollars off of licensing their music, so other churches could use it. So churches would pay them to use their music.
Oh, right. And they had levels of worshipers, depending on how
Yeah.
much money you gave, what you got. So it was like if you buy your $300 festival ticket and you're willing to pay another 800, you get to hang out with the bands. It was like that. And
Yep.
and this is how Brian Huston made his money. This is like he set it up this way on purpose. This wasn't new. This wasn't like Carl Lentz came in and did this in New York and everybody decided it was a good idea. This is what he was taught at Hillsong College to do.
Yeah, and we should point out that Brian Hudson, prior to all this, back in like the 90s, went to America to talk to a few spiritual folks and found the prosperity gospel folks,
Oh,
the televangelists and all that stuff, and realized, oh, I can use this. And this was that point where Brian was kind of like, people realized he wasn't super charismatic. He had his own church kind of separate from his dad, but not really. But he realized I can do these things and make a fuck ton of money.
yeah.
So that's what he decided to do. He decided to do that, which led into Hillsong, which led into Hillsong, New York City. This all just goes to a pattern of how can I make more money? How can I grow? How is growth and profit? Growth and profit becomes more important than message, more important than Jesus, more
He wrote a
important.
book about how to make more money, right? Like he wrote a book, like a get rich quick book. And then I think too, like this whole like sexy priester, whatever. Sexy preacher and his super hot wife, and they're like, hurry up and wrap these Bibles because we're gonna go give them out at the club at 2 a.m. and like all of that came from Huston's branding.
Yep.
Like that was not it, even in the documentary, it's presented like just this great idea I had out of nowhere. And it's like, no, it wasn't, man. Maybe you were convinced that it was your idea by the end of the meeting in which you pitched it,
Yeah.
but it wasn't because it all fits.
Yeah. Yeah. It's the idea of like having rap Bibles and going to the club and being like, here, have a Bible. It'd be like, get the fuck out of here.
Correct.
Somebody handed me that. I'd be like, you throw that over the side.
When it's like, boy, no, the DJ. It's like, okay. But he said he wrapped 7 Bibles and went to the club. So I'm like, actually, you just gave it to people you knew and said that you went and proselytized the club.
Yep.
Money theistic, not monotheistic. I love it.
That's a great term. Good job, Daniel. So, all right. So we got sort of New York City with Carl Lentz, and we'll get back to him. He comes into the story later back again because of course he does. Now we have to get back because now they do the kind of time hop way back to good old Frank Houston. So you want to start delving into that?
Well, like I said earlier, the journalists that were all working together on kind of trying to figure out what the fuck was going on at Hillsong, New York, saw the way that Huston went after Carl Lentz and went, this is really weird. Like, this is not how it's normally done, and there's got to be a reason. And then we find out the reason is that around the same time, the government of Australia has decided after 50 years to finally open a commission on child sex abuse in religious communities. And it turns out that Brian Huston's dad, Frank, is like public enemy number 1 in this thing. And it's so fucking bad. Like, it's so bad. And so we forgot to do trigger warnings at the start of this episode. And I think we already ran over some things that could be triggering. So I apologize. This is about to get real fucking triggering, and it's probably going to stay triggering for a while. Yep. So if like hearing about child sex abuse is going to be something that you can't handle, or in this circumstance, there's some real like nightmarish, like literally out of nightmares that children have stuff. You feeling cool tonight when you go to bed is like way more important than our live stream. We'll say that. So Frank was a traveling preacher. and also very charismatic and made good friends with a lot of congregants and people in these different towns. And what he would do is after the kids went to bed, he'd find time, excuse, and opportunity to go into the bedrooms in the middle of the night and skulk around in the dark and molest these kids in ways that are like literally some of these kids believed that they were having nightmares because it was so literally nightmarish. So like
Or
monster
their
dark.
or their parents told them it was nightmares. I mean, that's the other part is parents were disbelieving their kids that this stuff was happening. But yeah.
I have to say this, and I hate to say it, and this isn't anybody who specifically told their story, but just in a very general sense. I think some of those parents did believe their kids and said they didn't.
Yeah.
I
I don't disagree.
I think there's like a very I just think there's a very low chance of probability that when it was happening in their own home that they had no evidence to the contrary, especially after the kid said it the first time and the guy still kept coming around. They didn't keep an extra close eye on what was going on.
Yeah.
It just doesn't seem right. Like if I didn't believe my kid, which would be horrible of me and fuck me, but if I didn't, and then the next time that same person came over, they disappeared for like a long period of time, I might believe my kid then,
Yeah.
you know?
You would think.
So yeah. So there's hush money involved. There's all kinds of shit going on. I think there was probably some what we would understand to be trafficking in terms of like these parents making their children available. I
Mhm.
do think that that was happening. It's just impossible to for me to see it in a different way.
Yeah, me too.
Presented with evidence in the documentary, and as far as I know, it wasn't presented with evidence in any of these trials. So this is me speculating like out of my ass, but it's very hard for me to believe that that wasn't happening.
Yeah, I mean, Frank Houston also, we should clarify, he started in New Zealand. And when allegations started being rumored, he fled to Australia to quote unquote start the church in Australia. He was very
The church,
gung
right?
ho to say he was escaping possible scrutiny by police. He was getting away from that. So his pattern of abuse goes back way back to when he started, to back before he even at a church when he was at the Salvation Army.
Oh, that's right. Because
So he worked at the Salvation Army, apparently abused a kid there. And this was back.
Army, for our viewers at home or listeners or whoever you might be to us, you're unaware. The Salvation Army is not just associated with a church, it is a church.
Yep.
I just think it's really important because a lot of people don't know that. I'm just gonna say. So you can do your research on that before you give them money. But yeah,
And don't give them money because they are very much against LGBTQIA plus folks posts. So
in so many horrific and upsetting ways that lead to literal death.
yeah.
But I guess when all I wrote in my notes about that was Salvation Army Boys Home, it was because I was really not surprised, and also not surprised that he kind of got away with it, or he didn't kind of get, he did at the time.
Yeah. And part of it is this was at a time back in the 50s and 60s where we didn't have the awareness of things that we do now. And I'm not excusing it. That's not an excuse. It's just saying I think people were like, Frank, no, he's a good guy. Like, that sort of thing. He's a preacher. How would he do that? Like, there was very much a lot of passes given. And we've learned over time that that was a terrible time for most churches in that
Well, I
respect.
think there's also this element of like, because it would, this is why stigma is such a fucking problem, and I'd rather people talk about literally anything. Like, if you have a fucking necrophilia thing, like, I want you to find a safe place to talk about it. Because when you stigmatize something, what happens, right? And we saw this for so much of human history. When you have the creepy person who's molesting children, people don't say that guy's molesting children. They say to their children, "Don't be alone with that guy."
Yep.
And it's a really like so many people have been victimized by that guy who nobody was willing to call out in public or call the police on, or even talk to their kids when their kids actually did have something happen. And so stigma feeds this stuff and really I mean, this is a soapbox moment, so I apologize, but you get a these guys got away with it for so long because people didn't have the vocabulary or the opportunity really to say, I think that guy is fucking with our kids. Or the kids at the Salvation Army Boys Home who unfortunately were deemed probably less valuable than other kids.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So obviously Frank Houston goes to Australia and starts these churches, and they aren't known as Hillsong at this point. They're Assembly of God churches, and like he goes to a few names. There's some really dumb names. But
Always this progression of stupid ass names before we know
yeah,
it. Yeah.
yeah. So the abuse doesn't stop. He still continues. Um, abusers will continue to do what they can until they're caught, and
And yet
sometimes not.
more access as time went on.
Yeah. So the Australia thing is where the origins of Hillsong come. And Brian is at this point old enough to become an associate pastor under his father. So what's interesting is if you watch the clips, Frank Houston is not super compelling, but Brian is even less compelling. Like just really not a compelling figure to preach. Like we've all seen the super I'm going to use the word charismatic. That is a word that Pentecostals use to describe their pastors and all that stuff as
Yeah.
charismatic. So it's something like that. It's a little bit undefinable in my brain. My wife understands this better about how charismatic plays into that than I
Well,
do.
it's not just charisma. This is really interesting because I was part of a Unitarian church, so we'd have like guest speakers from all different religions, and we had somebody who was learning to be a preacher. So he came in to practice preaching to us. They're taught how to do all of the different intonations and how to get your attention and raise your voice at the right time, and like oh, they're taught how to do that.
Sure, there's a cadence to it
Probably
for
at
sure.
Hillsong College, but, Brian couldn't go to that college because it didn't exist before him.
Yeah. Um, yeah. So again, this is where we talk about how Brian kind of starts creating his own offshoot church. And that's where he goes to America and he learns about the prosperity gospel. And that's where he really starts growing the Australian church.
Yeah.
So Frank continues to keep abusing people, but that doesn't stop in the middle of all this. He just keeps
What I
doing
think
it.
is interesting is what we find out, and this is like a piece of contention in these royal investigation or royal commissions or whatever, is that the rumors were hitting kind of the mainstream. And that's when all of a sudden Brian was putting all his effort into Hillsong versus whatever his dad's thing was called at that time.
Yeah. We should also clarify that Hillsong wasn't something Brian came up with. Um,
Right. It was a musician he didn't pay.
Yeah, it was Jeff Bullock was the guy's name, who looks like a member of Air Supply, and Air Supply is Australian, which I think is great.
Watching that, and they're talking about like, oh, Jeff Bullock, he's so famous, he's this and that and the other. And I'm like, I think that I've heard that name actually. Like, I think that I've heard people talk about him in relation to music.
Yeah, apparently he was like an extraordinarily successful Christian artist. And again, I've never heard of him because I don't run in those circles as far
Right.
as, but
But yeah, so he was running the music team at the time and not getting paid and being scolded if he was worried about how the other musicians were being treated because it wasn't his job to care. And he came up with calling the music element Hillsong because it was like Hill's community, God's children, blah, 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 church music team. And he's like, come on, like, let's call it Hillsong. And Brian thought it was a bad idea at first.
yeah, and then he's like, oh, that kind of makes sense. Yeah. Um, all right. So we're getting into the point where, like you said, the Royal Commission's starting to get involved. Rumors are flying about. Um, there's this thing which I found really weird was the Assembly of God decided to have an emergency meeting in a Qantas lounge in an airport. Of all the places to go into a lounge in an airport to have this emergency meeting to discuss Frank Houston's accusations and all,
I mean,
like,
none of these people live in the real world is all I can figure out with some of the decisions that are made, like, "I gotta lie low, so I'm going to Florida. I gotta have this emergency private meeting, I'm gonna have it in an airport lounge." I like sorry.
but prior to that, before this emergency meeting, Brian apparently has a meeting with Frank to discuss these things, these allegations.
He
No,
allegedly has a meeting.
yeah, there's no witnesses, no notes, nothing. Just Brian's word that he had a meeting. I don't know. I find that dubious.
Well, he conflict of interest isn't something that ever even occurred to him, Doug. He's just the guy with the courage to do it.
What
Sorry, I made myself feel sick.
what a schwanz.
But he really fucking said that when the Royal Commission was like, "Don't you think it's kind of weird you were investigating your own dad?" Like, oh, never even occurred to me.
Yeah, just the innocence angle is so nonsense.
The other thing he said is when he found out about it, it was like jets flying into the twin towers of my heart. Or was it Seoul? Sorry, hold on.
Soul.
Oh,
It was soul.
jets flying into the twin towers of my soul. Okay, Amanda Palmer, calm the fuck down.
Yeah. Amanda Palmer. Like how you brought the Dresden dolls into this. That was great. Thanks.
Well, because you know she had her weird 9/11 poem. That's the only reason. I'm sorry. I don't mean
Yeah.
to add to the discourse around
Yes, I did call him a
that.
schwanz.
Oliver one, Zach.
That is correct. That's a mild expression for what I would like to
Oh my
say.
god. Yeah. Oh,
Yeah, we're going to go deep into Brian because this motherfucker is about to have his come up as to some degree at least. Um, what I find interesting is, all right. So part of this thing is there's a point where Frank offers a victim
Ted?
$10,000 if he forgives him, just forgives him.
Bullshit forgiveness cult. Let me tell you, this is like my biggest fucking hill to die on. My hill swan song, if you will. Sorry. I
Ah,
apologize. I finished my whole drink, so that's why I made that pun.
yeah, I have a little left. So
Um, but like the Christian influence on the culture at large, like you have to forgive people
no, you
so
don't.
that you feel better, that you heal, that you whatever. Like I don't forgive fucking anybody, and I'm a healed human being. Like for the fucking record, you do not have to forgive people. And if you have fucked somebody over and you have done the work and you've done as much as you can to make amends and you've improved yourself, they don't have to forgive you. And
Nope.
everybody gets to keep on living and nobody goes to hell because it isn't real. Like, you just, this fucking, it just made me so angry. Like, you have to forgive me. And it's like, but he knows goddamn well that he is a part of a church that tells people that they have to forgive to be healthy. But he knows that that's not why he's asking. He's not asking for forgiveness to heal that fucking victim.
Nope.
Ugh.
Yeah, it's a mess. Um, uh, so this victim agrees, says they forgive him, never gets the money because, of course, this victim apparently somehow gets a hold of Brian. I'm not sure how he does this, but good on them. Brian says he will get him money, but he clarifies that this is all his fault because he tempted his father.
Yeah.
This kid, when he was a kid, he was tempting his father, which is a very, very, all right. I'm going to go Christian specific on this.
Go
Is
for it.
the victim blaming is the way to go in a lot of these scandals. What were you wearing? Why were you doing it? Like it's your fault. You did this. This isn't their fault. You caused them to stumble, which is a big one. I know I hear that a lot. And it's something that like I said, Joe has talked about a bit with like specifically with women, but in this case, Frank's preference for abuse was young males or
Very
boys.
young. We're not talking about teenagers.
And we're talking like
It's
8.
okay to say that to a teenager, but like he's saying it to someone who probably had no concept of sex or sexuality at the time that this abuse happened. Like it's literally impossible for them to have had like anything resembling an involvement in this like that. Like it's ugly no matter who you say it to. It is unhinged to say it to someone who was too young to even know
What that
what
means.
that
Yeah.
means. Yeah.
Yeah. I just hate Brian Houston so much.
Oh yeah. And
Just
it's
the
like he's so yeah, and it but of course he claims he didn't know about he didn't know, he didn't know, he didn't know. That conversation happened years and years and years before he said he knew. This guy who had that conversation with Brian, who testified in these royal commissions, he finally realizes like I'm going to die and this guy isn't going to be punished. I'm coming forward as my with my name out in the open. Let's do this, which again, it's like this thing that happens in our society where if you are unwilling to cut yourself open and put your trauma out on the table for people to dig through, then you don't really have a chance at justice. And I felt
Mhm.
really upset that he felt the need to do that. Um, super brave and amazing.
But fucked up that he had to do that.
He had to. He should have been able to be anonymous because justice should have been served. It shouldn't have mattered.
Well, there's also the part where, uh, in this royal commission, Brian says that his dad at one point, because I think he passed in 2004, or was it 2014?
14.
14. That from 2009 to 2014, his dad started suffering from dementia, which is interesting because the person who diagnosed him with that was a board member of Hillsong. And under Australian law, if someone has a diagnosis of dementia, you can no longer question them. They are not of sound mind to be questioned for any inquiry.
Isn't it weird that that happened right before they were going to question him? Like, I don't
Yeah, and also they said that he was not allowed to preach anymore, and he was preaching all the way up and the way until he died. And they had the audio recordings of him preaching. Now, listen, if you know somebody with dementia, especially someone who's advanced, if you have a dementia and you're at year 5, that's usually pretty advanced. I've known some people who have dementia, and when they're at year 5, coherence is like not a strong suit of
Well,
theirs.
and it's just like your moments of lucidity of even knowing where you
Hmm.
are so rare that every individual one of those moments feels like a miracle to the people who care about the person with the advanced dementia.
Yep.
I've done like respite work as a volunteer project when I was in high school for people who were dealing with being the caretakers for their parents who had dementia. And it's like literally sitting in front of the TV watching cartoons or like Animal Planet or whatever non offensive content, like holding a stuffed animal or a baby doll, eating through a straw. And if they can like say hello and ask you how you're doing, you're like, oh my God.
They're here for a minute.
And then you almost feel guilty because you got that. And like when their kid and, you know, son in law, daughter in law come home, like that moment's passed and you can share it with them, but they don't get to have it or whatever. Like it's very, those people unfortunately are like absolutely lost in their own reality that has nothing to do. You can't just be like, well, pop, now we're in church. And then like, oh, I can turn it on. Like it just does not work.
Doesn't work that way. So another bullshit line from Brian, of course, because he's a slimy piece of shit.
And then
Um,
they ask Carl, why didn't people speak out? And this is where we find out what I think is the most interesting, most like nefarious shit I've ever heard. They had non-disclosure agreements at church.
mhm.
What trade secrets are happening if you just go by the Bible? Like what?
Yeah, there was some guy who said something like they obviously don't have trade secrets. So what are they hiding? What are they?
Well, I think they do have trade secrets because they run it like a corporation. But
Yes.
also, I think it is because here's the interesting thing about an NDA. It doesn't apply if what they're asking you to keep secret is illegal. But most people who sign NDAs don't know that.
Yeah.
And if you break the NDA and you get sued over it, it doesn't matter if you're right if you can't afford a lawyer. So
Yeah.
there's like levels to this, but yeah.
Yeah. It's a very Trumpian approach. I'm just going to sue you into oblivion until you can't afford to defend yourself. So, yeah.
The idea of a church being just like everybody there is signing ironclad non-disclosure agreements. It's like, what the fuck? Like, mm, mm.
So, all right. So let's talk a bit about Brian states that he had no idea of his dad's indiscretions. This is where we get back to Jeff Bullock, the music genius, who says that
That's weird.
Brian was telling him back in the 90s he knew of his dad's improprieties. And I'm using improprieties to be nice.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
But
that's probably what he said, right? So it's like whatever. But what I found interesting is that Brian throws his mom under the bus and says that she knew about it the whole time. And it's like, well, one, if you didn't know about it until like 2001, how do you know your mom knew about it the whole time?
yeah.
And two, like, is there no one you won't throw under the fucking bus to draw attention away from yourself? Your own
No, there is no one that he wouldn't throw under the bus. He'd throw anybody. Doesn't matter.
literally his own mother. And I'm like, okay, if I got to put this together, like, sure, there's a good chance that she knew because the rumors and stuff. But like, if anyone is gonna be the last to know, it's gonna be her. He was doing it while he was traveling. It's not like he was bringing people home and doing it in front of her.
Yeah.
Like, what? Like your mom, man? Your own mother?
Yeah.
His
All right.
son is so lucky. He seems to escape this fucking like just put all of the heat on someone else approach to life that Brian Huston has.
Yeah. So the commission wraps up and nothing happens. The police don't investigate. The police don't charge anybody. The reporters. There was a person who was in Congress in Australia who was a very big advocate for people who for child abuse survivors,
And
and
where
he
did
was
you
just
go to church, Doug?
no. This wasn't the PM. This was like a congressperson. That was the one guy who was like
Oh, right.
right. So, but what turns out there's some people in the pockets of Hillsong, including the North South Wales police commissioner, who was the person who would have brought charges, who refused to do anything. On top of the Australian prime minister, the prime minister of the entire nation went to Hillsong multiple times.
Yeah, he's like, well, I didn't like go to Hillsong.
I went to a local church, but I went to Hillsong.
Yeah.
Fuck off, you fucking slimy piece of shit.
And while all this is going on, where is Brian Huston? At the fucking White House having dinner with Trump.
Because of course Trump would invite him there, right?
Yeah, to pray for him. So yeah, nothing happened because the Hillsong fucking bought everybody.
Yeah, I want to say that we're getting into the episode 4 here, and the beginning of episode 4 starts with Revelations, and I was like, strong start.
Yeah.
Fucking strong start. Let's start with Revelations. Like, oh shit. Which I have a whole thing about Revelations not really being a thing until relatively recently in our history about how people talk about end times and all that shit. That really wasn't a thing for most
That's
of
why Revelations is so prevalent in so many cults. Yeah.
But so we're in this portion of Revelation. So now it turns into things where like Brian Houston is like kind of under the gun and being like accused. And, they did eventually, when the North South Wales police commissioner left, they did bring charges for covering up his dad's abuse. So, but it took a long time. But this quote, I think, is sort of emblematic of the Brian Houston mode of thinking. When bad things happen, good times are coming. Rooting for the apocalypse. Rooting for the apocalypse. These folks, and I'm sorry to say my in-laws are some of these folks, are so rooting for the apocalypse. They're so rooting for end times to come. And when they're doing that, they are rooting for your pain. They're not rooting for their exalted place. They're rooting to see everybody who doubted them or isn't believed get their fucking comeuppance. That
Yep.
is what Revelations is to the Christian community at large. At large, I'm not saying everybody, but like that's
A
what they're
lot
doing.
of them. And I
I
would
also,
say, even if you have a church that doesn't necessarily teach that, that doesn't mean the followers aren't spewing that shit all over Facebook. So whatever.
absolutely. I did have one comment that I wanted to ask you. Um, and it was a thing where I sent you the message. I'm like, well, that's certainly a suggestion. Google was I wrote the phrase, why is it charlatans? And then charlatans was like, said it was misspelled. And when I looked at the suggestion, it just said Christians, which I thought was fucking hilarious.
Let's
I
read
said,
stuff on Google Docs.
why is it that charlatans claim persecution and being held accountable and their followers just gobble it up? This doesn't just apply to uber faithful folks. It
I have
applies.
so many experiences with this that are like mind blowing, like baffling behavior from people.
Yeah. Like
Um,
Trumpsters are another example of this.
yeah, but going way back, right? Because like a lot of the Trump stuff, like these people were smart enough to keep it in private before now. But like, I had this, we'll say, friend, much older guy, and like hardcore Christian. And when I got this tattoo, I posted on Facebook, and he like made some shitty comment about how he hoped it wasn't on my wedding ring finger. And I was like, well, it is, because it's to commemorate my marriage. And he was like, something so ugly, there's something so beautiful, and like very, very shaming me. And when my friends were like, dude, this isn't cool. Or like, you don't know a whole lot about Christianity if you think skulls are like satanic, because like, what do you think Calvary means? He then came back like the wailing and gnashing of teeth about how the Bible said that Christians would be persecuted, and all your friends are persecuting me, and you're not standing up for me, so you're one of them. And just like this, just the biggest victim fucking shit I've ever heard. It's like, you came here and insulted me, and my friends very gently were like, don't insult my friend. And you are convinced that you're the victim because your particular preacher or pastor or whoever stood on the pulpit and focused on this little thing in the Bible that said you'd be persecuted. 70% of the country is Christian. You're not persecuted, bro. I don't know what the percentage is in Australia, but I bet it's high. Like,
Apparently, the Catholic Church is the largest church in Australia. They said that to docuseries as well, which I found.
well, yeah, but they don't think that Catholics are Christians because they only like the ones
fair. And Catholics don't think regular Christians are right either. Whatever. That's
but yeah, it's a game that is played in a lot of these churches of like, you are going to be persecuted, and you are going to be ostracized, and you are going to be so victimized. So when your leader is being sued or prosecuted or fucking whatever, it's like, see what they said is coming true. It's really happening, just like with the shit at Waco.
Yeah, it is. I will say again, my in-laws are very much emblematic of that. They are borderline wealthy, and they just say about how they are, as Christians, they're so persecuted, and and I'm just like, you wealthy motherfuckers, you you have zero issues. You can do whatever you want. You insult and criticize people to such a degree. And I'm sorry to go on a rant about my in-laws, but yeah, but it bothers me because it's emblematic of a lot of evangelicalism. It's just like, look at poor me. Poor me. I'm just trying to bring people to God. No, you are not. What you are trying to do is force people to believe in what you believe and adopt what you think is correct and make that law so people have to follow what you believe.
Right, because that's the issue. That is what they're talking about when they say they're being persecuted. They think they're being persecuted when someone else is allowed to do what they want to do. It's like, no, persecuting you would be not allowing you to do what you want to do. What other people are allowed to do doesn't have shit to do with you. Because we already have laws in place that say that if they do it to you, they go to jail. Like,
yeah, do that. Sorry, that is a very raw nerve with me, and it really bothers me. So, I have a few things to march through super quick.
yeah, Do it.
There was a comment where I think it was Carl Lentz who said the truest form of perfection is persecution.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just like, fuck.
Yeah.
Yeah. So now we're going to start getting to the unraveling of Brian Huston, whatever the fuck his name is. I don't care. He steps aside from Hillsong on advice of the board, which I found really funny because he's the one who picked the board. Because part of Hillsong's structure, which was he borrowed from his dad, was there's going to be a board of the church, but I will handpick who is on that board. There will be no vote. It'll be me picking people.
I love it because when you become such a liability, the people you handpick to benefit from your bullshit are like, buddy, we can't be with you. Like, you fucked up. And that's why I think that there is more that we don't know about Huston than what has come out, for the record.
Yeah, for sure. All right, so they start delving into the Hillsong College. This isn't like pertaining exactly to Brian Huston, but it establishes the culture of what Hillsong is. Do you want to speak a bit to that?
I got so wrapped around the axle on their interview questions that
the interview shit fucking infuriated me.
Well, it starts out as just like, the fuck are you talking about? And then it gets really upsetting. I guess the first part is also upset. Anyway, but I got so wrapped around the axle on that I think I missed some of the stuff that came after. But like, they legitimately have questions about, like, have you seen demons? Like, with your eyes, not like in your imagination or in your dreams or
when you run shrooms.
Yeah, or when you were like, have you looked in the corner of a room and seen a fucking demon there? And it's like, you know what? That is a great question to ask, because if anybody says yes, they need to see a psychiatrist.
Yeah.
But that's not the intent. Was not a mental health screening, right? So it'd be like, have you looked at any demons lately? Do you fucking jerk off? Have you looked at a woman with lust in your heart? All of that, and of course, it's all asked in a group, so everybody sees if you raise your hand. So nobody raises their fucking hand, which Carl points out, and I think he's right. It creates a culture of secrets, right, where people know that there's things they're not allowed to talk about. They learn immediately that you have to keep your sins quiet so nobody knows about you. But the other thing is, they would put a badge on people who...
A red dot. Red fucking dot.
And they were just ostracized because everybody on campus knew what it meant. Like, what the fuck? And then, like, in whatever episode, the guy fucking claiming that he didn't remember making that woman stand up in front of the congregation and apologize for getting pregnant before marriage.
She was married, yeah.
Like, bullshit, because you went to that college.
Yeah, that was Laura's school. That was Laura's dad. That was Laura Lentz's dad. And he was just like, well, I apologize for that. I don't remember. Like, nonsense. You did that 100 times. I guarantee it.
Oh, yeah. And he learned it from... It's how Hillsong operates. It's what they're teaching the people they're putting through their personalized fucking preacher school, right? And you're going to tell me that one of the founding preachers didn't do it?
Bullshit.
I'm sure, given how this church has treated his family, he regrets a lot of the things that he did. But, like, dude, you're not, like, you're doing worse at taking responsibility than your philandering son-in-law. Okay? Yeah. And he's not doing great.
No, but you're not doing great either. So, yeah.
So they're ostracizing people. Like, this is like scarlet letter shit. And the thing is, I got a red dot. You don't know if it's because I fucking doubted the Bible yesterday or if it's because I'm giving hand jobs at the local truck stop. You just know I have a fucking red dot. Like,
scarlet letter stuff. So, yeah.
And then, of course,
it's red.
A guy who was kicked out of college because he was molested because he was told that was homosexual activity. That
made me so fucking angry. And yeah,
he was like a big deal in the church. He was supposed to be going on a tour with
tour.
music because he was a great drummer. And they're like, no, you were molested by a church leader at a different church, and therefore you did gay stuff. You can't go. And then another woman who was there to learn how to be a preacher admitted that she was struggling with homosexuality because that was the phraseology at the time. And
Yep.
she's basically put into like
She
her
called like a soft version
soft
of
conversion therapy. Yeah. Because it was like, well, let's find out why you're gay.
a soft version of conversion therapy. So yeah, they were just shitty.
So what I think though, Doug, and this goes back to what I was saying about like maybe Carl didn't know he was supposed to hate gay people. It's like maybe only the people who admitted to same-sex experiences, whether consensual or not, were the ones that got any pushback on LGBTQ issues because they're the ones who needed to be fucked with in the eyes of the college.
Well, the idea that Carl said he was sexually abused as a kid, I mean, he hid that. He clearly hid it so that he could, now maybe part of that was a mental, but maybe he was just like, I wasn't thinking of that and just being like, I'm just going to block all that in my brain because your brain's weird. It will do stuff like that. It will block trauma,
Well, and we know like what it seems like happened with that drummer is that he was struggling with the trauma and went for help and then was told, oh, you're gay, so
Yeah.
get out of the band. Whereas if you weren't in the moment struggling with that trauma, or you were struggling with it without realizing that's what you were struggling with, as someone with PTSD, I have been there for years on end before figuring my shit out, so I know it happens. Like, it's possible, like you said, it's just like, because the thing that really struck me too is he said, Carl said, he struggled with lust this, lust that. Oh, I thought when I got married, it would go away. I thought when I had kids, it would go away. And I think that comes from this kind of college environment as well, right? Where it's like,
Yep.
these are just bad things. To be attracted to women is a bad thing. To want to look at porn is a bad thing. To have been sexually abused is a bad thing. But if you do everything right, they'll go away. And then when they don't go away, they feel much bigger and more, special, for lack of a better term. And you have people acting out in ways that are really destructive. I believe that culture of secrets goes that deep and also influences people to believe that, okay, well, once I finish college, this Bible college, then it'll go away. But it doesn't. And it's like, well,
Yep.
okay, but when I get married, these bad feelings will go away. And then they don't. It's like, okay, but when I start working at the church and giving that my all, then it's going to go away. And it never fucking goes away because human beings have feelings, right? And he did mention when in this whatever therapy being told like stop using the term lust. Take that to Bible camp. We're in therapy.
Yeah.
And I thought that was really interesting because it's like,
Well, that is a key phrase for a lot of evangelicals. If you have lust in your heart is a phrase
right.
that they use quite a bit.
And it's
Because
like I'm sure
and,
like
and isn't lust also one of the 7 deadly sins?
it is. And that's the thing is that you're equating this is the other thing, right? Is if I equate I'm walking down the street and I see somebody that I think is hot and I have a reaction to that involuntarily. I equate that the same as if I fucking murdered someone. Then like why wouldn't I just fuck them? Because I'm already going to hell. Like it's already done. I already did the mortal sin. Like, and I'm not saying that's the literal thought process, but it's like that's kind of how the human psyche works, where it's like, well, I'm already fucked. So I might as well get what I want
So you might as well go get fucked.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I mean when I say
Sorry.
a certain amount of empathy, because religion does really weird things to people's heads when it comes to normal, healthy, sexual thoughts, feelings, etc. And then if you pair that with actual childhood sexual trauma, fuck, right? Like, and then, looking at his situation where he's being overworked, it's like, man, we're kind of lucky he didn't like blow up the church when it was full of people
Yeah.
for the amount of help he was actually getting, like actually asking his spiritual mentor for help and being told to work harder.
Yeah.
But I felt like the college thing really pulled that into focus. And then we see from their playbook how they deal with allegations I don't know if you want to take that one.
Well, basically allegations, it's again, I'm going to pull into the whole, they usually you do a scapegoat of alcohol, drugs, something that was influencing them, and it was a one-off. The one-off is the like standard for Hillsong specifically. Brian Huston said that about his dad. He said that about himself when he had an indiscretion where he basically was texting. Well, there was two incidences where he texted a woman and she was uncomfortable, and then there was an incident where he went to a hotel room and proclaimed he had taken too much of one of his meds and had alcohol, and that made him loopy. So he didn't remember anything that happened in the hotel room, which
I'm going
is
to tell you that
mighty convenient.
I accidentally double dosed my mental health medications once, and then went drinking on vacation. The time difference is what screwed me up. I didn't have illicit sexual encounters. I barfed all night, like. And I think that my experience might be a little bit more common than accidentally having an affair.
Yeah, I agree. So there's an interesting thing that happens, and this is from the reporters, where this guy says two men got together to play golf, which is an interesting way to start a story that really fucks up the whole Hillsong thing.
Oh, well, before that, though, I was going to say at the college.
Oh, yeah. Sorry.
A girl whose name, she appears in the documentary, she's named in the documentary, her name is Anna Crenshaw, and she is groped by a staffer named Josh something.
No, Jason Mays.
Yeah. And first they're like, it's no big deal. These things happen, blah, 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 blah. Maybe you were showing your shoulder. I don't know. And so she's like, fuck this. She went to the cops. The cops were like, no, that's assault. And Brian Huston came to Jason's rescue. He gets promoted. He gets lifted up. He gets counseled because what a horrible thing to have happened to him. And she gets booted. She has to go away. And the reason I wanted to bring that up is because we see, like, when you talk about it being a culture issue, it starts at this college that they send all of their preachers through, and all of the women who are going to marry their preachers, and all of the people who are going to nanny their kids, and also marry their preachers, maybe, depending. Like, everybody's going through this freaking college being taught that this is how things are done.
Yeah. Well, and to that point, we should point out that Jason Mays' dad is the head of HR for Hillsong, so that plays into it. So more favoritism to that point. And when Brian talks about what happened with the assault, was that he said it was a bad decision, blames alcohol, and then just, it's like, well, it's just alcohol, and it was a bad decision on his part, and just like it's an indiscretion, a one-off. Again, the one-off.
If members of this church have such an issue with alcohol, then maybe alcohol being the root of all of these issues.
Sounds like a Schwantz college.
It does. Thank you, Zach.
Thank you, Zach. Yeah. So getting back to the point where, like I said, the college is the groundwork. That's where they lay all the groundwork for how people understand how Hillsong works, how women should be treated, how women work in the church.
When the women are even being told to cover up more, right? And it's like they're already at a Christian college. This is the thing that is interesting to me, is I'm sure the women were dressed very modestly, but like the guys.
Hey, Carl Lentz walking around shirtless with Justin Bieber.
With his fucking dick V, like on full display, his happy trail out, because he's supposed to be sexy, because that markets the church. But the girls at the college have to cover up, because what if you make Jason grope you? We'd have to kick you out if you made somebody do that.
Yeah. Again, inequality in a large scale. But anyhow. What is interesting about this golf story is two guys go to golf. One is at Hillsong and one is not. And the guy who's still at Hillsong says, "What made you leave?" And he said, well, his mother had an encounter, quote unquote, in a hotel room with Brian Houston, and then signed an NDA, and which he weirdly had brought with him, which I thought was interesting. to this
He
golf
showed
outing.
it to him, so I don't know if he had it, if he showed it to him later or what. They didn't make it clear.
It made it sound like they did. Maybe he brought it later, but
I hope so, because or maybe it was a setup. Maybe he's like,
yeah,
I'm
yeah.
gonna.
Well, the person at Hillsong went to his mentor, and the mentor said, "Yeah, that happened also with somebody I know, with Brian." So, yeah, this is where we start getting Brian doing his indiscretions.
It was
They're
just one
just,
time, Doug. So how is it possible that these two men both know a woman who it happened, a different woman?
I don't know, because that happens to every woman. That every woman has had an experience that we would think, oh, well, that doesn't happen to every woman. It happens to every woman.
It certainly happens to every woman who meets Brian Huston.
Very, very true. Well, so now we get to the point where apparently both women were given hush money and made to sign NDAs. Yeah, so Brian Hudson just really starts getting into the weeds here. Word gets to the elders, which I think is funny. We're using the word elders in the church is like word gets to the elders, like we're in Lord of the fucking Rings or some shit.
It looks like somebody is running up a hill with a little wax.
I have a scroll for you, sir. Like you.
My favorite part about this is that they do a Zoom, and the guy's like, "I certainly hope no one's recording this."
Actually, my favorite part of that Zoom is that Brian Hudson's wife is on the Zoom.
Oh, I didn't notice that even, but I just love the guy who's like, "Certainly hope no
Oh
one's
no, but it's returning this, la di da. That
watching it." So I guess someone was. Oh,
well,
you have to say it.
yeah. Well, on that Zoom call, they say that Brian said that he would pay $25,000 to this person, and that way it shouldn't be on the church. With it, I don't want to make
He's
it
so
on the church.
angry because that little shitty guy who hoped no one was recording it kept presenting that as though it were like, look at Brian being responsible. He didn't want the church to pay for it. It's like, oh, fuck you. The church couldn't have paid for it in any legal way because
Right.
it's not legal to do that, first of all. Second of all, he didn't do it out of the goodness of his fucking heart. He didn't want this meeting to happen. He didn't want you to know. He didn't want anyone to know. That's why it was hush money.
Yep.
If you ask the church to pay for it, they know about it. Dipshit.
All right. So then we get into the point where Brian actually went into a woman's hotel room, and this is where he claims he was overdosed. He took too many of his pills, got drunk, went in her room, was in there for 40 minutes, proclaims he remembers nothing. My favorite is Hillsong returns her donation and her conference fees. That's their.
Here's what I want to know. If you just, okay. So I'm at a conference and another conference attendee, someone I respect, shows up and they're a little bit shit faced. But they're not so shit faced that I'm stuck with them all night. They're just 40 minutes shit faced, need to get themselves together and go back out. Right. And nothing untoward happens. Maybe they puke in my toilet, but I'm not the one cleaning it. Like, whatever, right? They puke in my toilet. They're like, ugh, and then they leave. What is the complaint that I'm making that gets my stuff refunded?
Nothing.
Why am I not calling up like, guys, I'm really concerned. Someone needs to come help Brian Huston. He's having some kind of medical emergency.
Yeah, something's wrong. But they don't do that.
No, 40 minutes of absolutely nothing happened and no complaint was made. However, she needed to be refunded all of her fees in her hotel room and paid money from Brian out of the goodness of his heart because nothing happened.
But Brian did pay that person a sum of money. Again, so the church shouldn't have to be inconvenienced.
Right.
Which is funny. One of the things that I found funny from that Zoom call too was maybe it wasn't that. Maybe it was a separate Zoom call where they discussed it. They took claims. Hillsong claims they took claims seriously and did their own investigation. And per that call, the kind of hippie dude with the beanie and the long hair said the decision was made to give what I guess I would call grace and not to cover up what happened, but not to expose. That is a cover up. You can't. I'm not going to expose it.
This is what
that
grace
means you're covering.
This is what grace looks like. Grace looks like Pastor Brian, or whatever they call him, is going on sabbatical for 6 months to a year to do some therapy and spend time with his family because he fucked up, but we all fuck up. That's why we've got Jesus. So please don't gossip. Please respect him in his time of need. And he will hopefully be back preaching here on Sundays, as you know and love him ASAP. That's fucking
Right.
great. A cover up is don't tell anyone that any of this is happening. And also pay multiple women hush money.
That's a cover up. Like you can't. Again, I love how they try to rephrase it, which is again another classically like a very political way of doing things. Like, well, I'm just going to say it in this fashion.
It's not a cover up if I say it's not a cover up.
Yeah.
A little loophole I found.
So yeah. Well, like you said, now
As
we should state that Brian does go on a vacation after all this,
and post
which
tons of pictures of him having a fantastic fucking time on
yeah,
social
and
media.
which his dad did too when he was under a bunch of accusations. So the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, apparently. So
I like that he and Bobby, his wife, went absolutely fucking nuts when they were treated the same way they treated Carl and Laura Lentz.
yeah,
It's like
proclaiming it was on.
you told them how to treat people who do these things. You told them, you made them like this is what we do. So yes, that's what they did, dipshit.
You gave them the playbook, and they followed the playbook, and you didn't like the playbook anymore. So
It was supposed to be for other people who got in my way.
yeah, not for me. Um, yeah, so Hillsong Brian actually resigns. Like he's just like, well, but he doesn't actually announce the resignation, which I find basically he was forced out.
Very interesting, yeah. Well, it's funny too, right? Is like they said that Laura Lentz resigned when actually she was told she had to.
Yep.
And then he was fired, but he got to say that he resigned. It's like, ooh, we're all fucked up, aren't we?
Yeah. All
Um,
right. Go
I
ahead.
the one thing I want to throw in here is the Vanity Fair reporter who says that, oh, it's so good that Carl's working on himself, but he owes whatever to the congregation. I just want to go on record and say, no, he's not fit to lead. He owes them an apology, which he didn't give. I'll give that. But he owes them nothing. What is he supposed to do? He cannot be a preacher. He can't
Yep.
go give back to that community because he's been ostracized from it, and for good reason. Don't inflict him on those people anymore. He needs to put on his big boy pants and take responsibility and say, sorry, yes. That is it. This is
Yeah.
not a situation where him going and fucking meddling with these people's spiritual lives is going to make anybody feel better.
Yeah, it's not. So yeah. He can't do anything more than offer an apology, which is like you said, if he did anything, it was very like quarter hearted. Like it was just like, I know I fucked up, but Hillsong fucked up too. And I'm like, that's not how you accept accountability. That's not how you do that.
He didn't accept accountability for things that were like pretty easy to accept accountability for, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Like, I'm like a white dude who was overworked and confused about how life works, and I fumbled race relations in my church. Like, cool, like that's so everyone would be like, no shit, man, you're a fucking rich white dude.
Yep.
But yeah, he didn't. I think that the reporters do make a good point about like when it's hard for me to say this as somebody who is no longer religious and doesn't give a shit about religion, because I didn't like leave religion because of something like this. But like when a spiritual leader fails their congregation in the ways that someone like Carl, but especially like Brian and Frank Huston have, it is more damaging than in other situations.
Sure.
Because it doesn't just threaten the relationship that person has with the person who failed, it affects their relationship with their entire worldview, both of this life and the next. And that is a lot to put on a person. And I think that people should be able to work through their spirituality on their own terms without being taken advantage of. And if they end up at a point of leaving should be because they worked it out for themselves, not because it became unsafe for them, not because someone else ripped the rug out from underneath them. I think like spiritual abuse, sexual abuse by spiritual leaders, these kind of things are bigger and heavier than other instances. Not all other instances, but than many.
Many.
Because people feel like their souls hang in the balance of these issues. And that is too much power to give anybody, but it happens. And it does break my heart. Like I want people to I don't have a problem with people being a religion that I'm not. So I don't want them to have to feel like they have to leave it because their whole world has been turned upside down, and not just because like they read the Bible a little bit more closely and decided it wasn't for them.
Yeah. Agreed. Let's talk a bit about, before we start getting into the end of things here, because I want to talk to you about Carl and Laura and their redemption arc and all that stuff. But first, Brian Houston was charged with covering up his father's sexual abuse. And he ended up getting acquitted, which is, hey, he was in court. That's fucked up. But like,
I don't know how you prove when somebody knew something unless there's like
a real smoking gun. But apparently there was stuff written down and all that stuff. So maybe it just wasn't compelling enough. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. All right. So before we wrap things up, let's talk a bit about Carl. And at the end of this docuseries, they're doing a whole lot with Laura and Carl and how they are working through things and what's happening. Where are you at as far as Carl and Laura and what's true and what isn't, or what you feel in relation to those?
I think that Carl is genuine about wanting to change and to heal the parts of him that cause him to hurt other people. I don't think he's there yet. I think he is genuinely sorry about what he did to Laura, but it's hard to know because we start the documentary out with people saying they believe he can cry on cue.
Yes, there's that part.
And I think that Laura is straightforward. I think she's being very open and vulnerable. I don't have reason to doubt anything she has said. She has talked about things that I think so many people would be too embarrassed to admit, like having caught Carl and Leona together and then still being able to be convinced that nothing was going on is like something I don't think a lot of people would want to admit publicly. So to me, it feels like she is like gotten to a place in whatever self-work she's doing where she is like released shame about what Carl has done and wants to like speak about it to other people. Which I think is like a sign of vulnerability and healing more than anything.
Yep.
I worry about the environment she's in.
Me too.
I worry that, I don't know. Everybody says what she said, and they often mean it, which is that she is with him because she sees that he is working and becoming a better person. And if she hadn't seen it, she'd have left. And if she stopped seeing it, she will leave. But what happens if she stops seeing it after they move out of mom and dad's house and they're on their own again and their financial whatever is invested in him and it's been another 5 years and the kids are just about to graduate high school or whatever? Like those are the things I worry about for people in her situation. I do like that she sort of made a point of addressing it because I think we do often like vilify women for staying more than we vilify the idiot who cheated.
Yep. Agreed.
And everybody thinks they know what they're going to do in a situation until it happens to them. So like you could sit and say like, I would leave in a heartbeat, but like, you don't know that.
Yeah.
Even if you have been in a situation where your spouse cheated on you and you left, you don't know if you would in that situation. It's just like, whatever. So, I have, for some reason, I have a very easy time trusting her. I have a very complicated relationship with my trust of Carl.
Yeah, I'm pretty much on the same page. Like you said, Carl said that people said Carl can cry on cue. And he is pretty emotional in this. He might just be an emotional person.
True.
but it could be something where he uses emotion to manipulate folks too. I would like to think that he's doing his best, and I do believe he is trying. I do believe that. I think he sees that, like, his kids and his wife are like they're super important to him, and he lost sight of that and fucked up. And I do agree with you that I believe Laura is like, if I don't see him striving to be better or to work on himself, then I'm out. I believe that. And her saying, I don't need him, which in evangelical circles is a big fucking deal. That's a
huge
big deal.
I think it's a
So
big deal for anybody in any long-term relationship that has faced a major challenge also, though, because externally evangelical culture says that, but like we literally have a biological drive to be with our person, like it is created through chemistry and everything else. That feels like, divorce feels like being widowed. It is second only to being widowed, other than losing a child, like as a minor, right? So, like, every time you meet somebody, no, well, hopefully they're not telling this when you meet them, but like, you know, somebody who's going through like a really rough patch in a long-term relationship is trying to decide if they're going to leave or not. Like, you have to watch them go through the process of figuring out that they don't actually need the other person. It just feels like they need them. And so I think it's a big deal, period, but it's an extra big deal in the circle she runs in. If that
yeah,
makes
for
sense.
sure. So that's super well said. Anything else we need to talk about before we wrap all this up?
No, because we already talked about her telling him that he had to get hit in the head by How to Deal with Your Husband Who's a Piece of Shit books or whatever. And I really liked that.
Yeah. And him being like, can we get rid of this? She's like, no. And he's like, all right, guess that's what I got to do. So, all right. So we are going to wrap this up, but we should talk a bit about what we were doing next month. This was your choice, which I'm super excited about because I know very little about this.
Mostly what I know about it is we're going to have a bad time.
Oh, okay, good.
Um,
Like every other episode.
Yeah, it's a pretty rough one. Lots of misogyny, spiritual sexual abuse, ickiness.
Great.
I just felt like it was time. We were doing one. We haven't done a non-Christian one for a while, it feels like.
That's fair. That's fair. This one, Hillsong's the one that the first one I think we've done that was very explicitly Christian, in the sense that it is very explicitly evangelical Christian. I think we've done branches of Christianity in different facets, but this is the first one I think was explicitly in that vein. So,
well, it's like Hillsong could theoretically not be a cult, depending on how tight you are with your definitions. I think it is.
agreed.
But yeah, like the Daughters of the Cult was definitely that was a cult,
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. All right. Well, Renee, this has been awesome, as per the usual. Again, apologies to folks that we had to delay this week. It was me traveling. So, yeah.
And just thanks for everybody who like very happily just moved right on over to YouTube or one of our personal Facebook pages to watch this after Facebook was mean to us and said we couldn't send it to our Facebook group anymore.
Yeah. So thanks, Zuckerberg. All right. Well, folks, thanks for joining us. Renee, thanks for all this. You're great. And I'm super happy to be doing this with you. So, and we will see you on June 5th. Bye.
Bye.